welcome back to this installment of Voices in Cloth. I'm really, really excited to meet Kathryn Newton. Darling, it's lovely to have you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. And you?
Good, and I will call you Kathy from now on.
Thank you. That's great.
So, Kathy, tell us a little bit about you. Where do you come from, and how long have you been quilting?
So I was born and bred in Johannesburg, and that's where I still live. But because of my husband's work, we've actually had quite an exciting life that we weren't anticipating early on. And the first big excitement was in 1991. My husband was transferred to Houston by a South African company, and we were
Oh,
supposed, I know,
it's the heart of quilting. That's so
and
exciting.
I wasn't a quilter at that time. I was a sewer,
No.
but not a quilter. But because the kids were in school and my husband was at work all day, I had to find things to do. And so I started off with a friend, making my very first quilt. I'd never made one before. And it was at one of the local quilt stores, and it was a log cabin Christmas tree. It was about 1 meter by 1 meter in size. And I thought, oh, well, that was a nice thing to do, nice craft. And then I
When
opened the
was this?
paper
What year
one
was
morning.
this?
Sorry, oh, this was
What?
1991.
Okay.
I opened the newspaper one morning, and there was this like 5 pages of stuff about Houston Quilt Festival, which I had never heard of.
Wow.
So I was off to town and I went to the quilt festival. I had never seen anything so inspiring in all my life. And that was it. I was hooked from then on. So
Oh,
that's how
that's
I started.
amazing. So that's what got you into it. And how did you
Yeah.
then carry on?
So we actually came back to South Africa much sooner than we had expected, but I knew that there was a quilt group in my suburb. So I contacted the lady who was in charge at the time. She was actually my kid's piano teacher. And I said to her, this is what happened, and I'm dead keen to get into a group. So she said, well, it is a closed group, but somebody's just resigned, and we keep our numbers to 12. So
Wow.
I know. So I was able to get straight into a group, which was absolutely amazing. That's where it started. And then I took a job for a while, and I didn't have much time for quilting. Um, and then our next big adventure was that my husband he took a job in Singapore.
Oh, right.
And so I went off to Singapore, knowing nobody and didn't know the city at all.
All the
But
language. You're very brave to do this. What did your husband do to travel so much?
so he's a process engineer, chemical engineer.
Wow. Clever
Um,
man.
and they're big, certainly just around Houston and that area. There are lots of oil processing plants. Um, but actually, they were trying to work on a modification to a plant here in South Africa.
Hmm.
And in fact, it never happened. And I think that's why they brought us home in the end a bit early. Um, but then the Singapore thing lasted for 9 years. Uh,
Wow.
and believe it or not, there were two really strong quilting groups in Singapore. In fact, there were more, but there were two quilt shops. And I went to the one that I first discovered. And those girls became my family. For
Oh,
9 years, we were each other's support system.
it is
And
extraordinary because I've found that as well, that the people that you quilt with and the people that you sew with, they do become a surrogate family. They do become so
absolutely.
integral in your life.
Well, I mean, when your family's so far away, you've got to make a plan somehow.
It's
And
true.
it just happened very naturally. It was wonderful. They were such nice people. You you need the companionship. I mean, if you go into a city and you don't know anybody, you've got to find a way of meeting people. And a quilt shop is one of the best places to go if you want to meet people.
It really is. What do you think has been your best project you've done in quilting?
There are actually two that stand
Mm.
out, and I had them quilted by Talene Jeffrey, who I'm sure you
No,
know.
no, the Talene
The
Jeffrey.
quilter
She's
for South Africa pretty well.
she's amazing.
Um, So my son asked if I would make him a Japanese themed quilt.
Wow.
Um, so I had some books and I pulled out some stuff, and I'd been to Japan. I went to a quilt festival there in 2008, the Yokohama Festival, from Singapore for a few
Hmm.
days. And I'd bought, you know how you do, you go around and you see there's gorgeous stuff and you think, oh, I might use that. So you buy a few, all of that. So I had all of that. And then I had Kitty Pippin's books.
Right.
Um, and so I used some themes from there, and um, I I just pulled images from all sorts of places. At the time, my son was doing kendo, so he had a breastplate. It's a martial arts thing, and he had a breastplate, and I kind of copied the design on that with cord, and that was one of the blocks. And I did various other Japanese things, and in fact bought the borders in Japan on my trip there in 2015. So it's very, for me, it felt a very authentic quilt because it had Japanese components in it all the time. And it turned out to be lovely. And Celine quilted it beautifully. It's an absolute heirloom. And he treasures it, which is great. He doesn't eat food on it and do all the silly things that some boys do.
You trained him well.
I trained him well. Actually, one of his stories is that he got trained very well because when we went to Houston, he was 7, I think.
Mhm.
Um, and it was summer, so the schools were all closed when we arrived. So he spent the first 2 months of his life in Houston following me and my daughter around quilt shops or fabric shops. He reckons he knows fabric better than most boys.
Oh, how wonderful. And what was your second favorite project?
So the second favorite project I actually started in Singapore,
Mhm.
and it's called The Joys of Winter.
Oh, wow.
Um, and it's a very detailed hand applique quilt with beautiful insertions to put the blocks all together. So it's asymmetrical, and the fabrics were gorgeous. It was a kit, but it, the lady in the shop had just collected the fabrics month by month and put them in. So it was that kind of kit. Um, and every month you got a block, and it took me much longer than that. I think I was 14 years in the making eventually.
Wow. No
But
wonder it's such a special piece.
I finished it actually in time for the Cape Town Festival, and it was on display there, not judged, but it was there. So the Japanese quilt is in England because my son emigrated to England 5 years ago. The other quilt is here.
Have you ever made a quilt for yourself?
Yes, actually,
Yay.
every 3 or 4 quilts, I decide, okay, this quilt will fit our bed,
Okay.
and then I make it for our bed. So we've got a king size bed, so it has to be a very big quilt then.
But do you ever
Um,
sit down and go and say, I love that quilt, I'm going to make that for me?
well, the Joys of Winter was definitely that quilt. Well, we weren't here for Christmas. We were actually in the UK to visit my son, but I intend to hang it at Christmas every year, even though
Fabulous.
it's not winter here.
So tell me, what drew you to the Voices in Cloth program?
I actually was on the Russian tea ceremony at the Cape
I
Town
went to
Festival.
one, yes.
You went, and I was on. My husband and I were on that. So I saw what a lovely, bubbly person you were, and when I found out that you were doing this project, there's a group of us who all decided that we were going to enter our quilts.
Well, thank you all for doing it. It means so much to me. I can't thank you enough.
So we were among those first few.
You were number 10.
I know. Um, so yeah, I just thought what a lovely idea it was that our quilts should get overseas exposure because we are down at the bottom end of the world. Um, and we're not always able to make our voices heard. And that there it was, absolutely. So
Tell me a little bit about your quilt and how you came up with the idea of making it.
well, I mentioned Shweshwe earlier. I find the colors in Shweshwe so exciting. They're a definite reflection of South African um, Rainbow Nation. But not only that, I just think that they're joyful and uh, there's so much that you can do with them. I know there are people who can't stand Shweshwe because it smells. And it takes a long time to get that dressing out of the fabric. But it's exciting to work with because it's firm, it doesn't wobble, doesn't go all over the place. So I decided that if I was going to do something about voices in cloth, um, Shweshwe was definitely a South African voice. And then I, the center of my quilt is a barbet, which is a very well-known bird in South Africa, and it has a very distinctive call. And for me, although most people think the hardy-dar might be South Africa's bird, I think one of the birds that's very distinctive for me is the barbet. So that's why I decided that I would put a barbet in my quilt. So those are African voices.
Do you feel as a woman of a certain age, you become invisible?
I don't actually feel that myself because I'm fairly outgoing. So
But
I
that's
make
wonderful.
myself
And I'm so
visible.
glad that's your answer because it's, you know what I'm asking. It's
I
just,
do know exactly what you're asking. I mean, there are people who become invisible, and you know where I do notice it in clothing. When I look for fashionable clothing for women of our age, it's very hard to find stuff that's up to date and funky.
it is. It is.
Every now and again, there's a chain that pops up, with nice stuff. But we have woolies. Well, you must know we have
Of
woolies here
course,
because you're
Woolies
South
shackles are
African.
my life.
Uh, and I love woolies because their basics are so great, but
Yeah,
they often get it wrong for women of our age.
they do. It was an interesting thing because when you were saying that you feel that the voices down south in South Africa aren't heard as much, it was just that question I think is such an important one because I think the more society recognizes that they do something, perhaps they'll stop. Because my closest friendships are with women who are older than my mother, the same age as my
Yeah,
mother,
yeah,
and they're incredible women, and they are, when I tell my other friends who are in their 40s and 30s and say to them, oh my gosh, I went out for lunch with Sylvia and Joe. And they're like, who? I said, Sylvia and Joe, the ladies who work with me. And I said, who are they? How old are they? And I was like, 21, of course. Sylvia would stab me otherwise. But it's so foreign for people who are younger to actually have dedicated friendships with women who are older.
yes.
And it's so enriching in my life. And it's just something I find extraordinary that people don't do.
Interestingly, I have found recently that I have made a few much younger friends, girls in their
Good. Keep that
20s and
going.
30s who
Wonderful.
are just interesting people, and we've got stuff in common. They're not necessarily quilters, actually. One's in my Pilates class.
Wonderful. No, I love that. I think it's wonderful. What do you think will come from the Voices in Cloth miniature series?
I don't know. I'm finding it's really hard to draw younger girls in to quilting. They're all needing to support their families, their career ladies, um, and it's our cry all the time. Let's try and get some younger people in. There are a few, and they're quite dynamic. They need to fit in, so they are, lovely, uh, voluptuous personalities, um, but not enough. And I think that's my fear that um, quilting is not going to be sustained in South Africa because not enough people are coming in at the bottom. The
I
other
think
problem is that fabric is so expensive here. So we also have local fabrics, Shweshwe and those African wax prints that are coming in from further up Africa. So we do have a source of less expensive fabrics. But if you want to do a Tula Pink or a K Facet or all of those wonderful designers, um, it's tough on the budget.
it is.
So then it's obviously, I won't say it's a worldwide thing because I think, well, fabric has obviously got more expensive in the States. but because of the volume of quilters and fabric around, they keep it at a much more affordable price.
And I think economy-wise, worldwide, I think everybody's retail everywhere is brutal right now. Nobody's got much
Mm.
for luxuries. Everything's gone up. Fuel, electricity, interest rates, everything's gone up. Everything's more expensive. So everybody's more cautious. And let's be honest, we have got stashes that are far exceeding all of our life expectancies. So we're dipping into that.
You should see mine. My husband said to me while we were in Singapore, build a stash because when we get to South Africa, you aren't going to be able to afford fabric in the same way. So I did.
But isn't that
I half
special?
thought of making that my background, but it's actually too obscene to show.
But there isn't a quilter in this world who doesn't relate to what you just said.
I know.
But all we do is we turn it to face the clear wall, not the stash.
Exactly.
Do you now you've got the unique experience of having had a lot of exposure to quilters outside of South Africa. Do you think South African quilters are different to quilters from around the world?
No, I think, I mean, I think in every country you're going to get pedestrian quilters who like very old traditional colors and styles, but you always get somewhere rising the people who are adventurous, and that's been my experience. Not so much in the States because I was still too new to it then, but certainly in Singapore. I mean, the girls were very imaginative, made beautiful quilts of all different styles, and yeah, I just think that South African quilters are also like that. And obviously, our festivals are a showcase for those really interesting quilts, and some more pedestrian, but the workmanship's so good. You
Well, you
know,
have to look at the Cape Town Festival. The lady, and I
yeah,
forget her name, who won the traditional section in the I want to say the junior category, not the masters category, the junior
yes,
category,
yes,
where she came first and second. But you looked at those quilts, and my jaw was hanging open. I'm not a traditional quilter. I love traditional blocks. I love it. Traditional quilting's not really my bag that makes me joyful. But her quilts, they just blew me away. Because
yeah,
I tell you, when people do it right, my goodness, it's incredible. And such a lovely
absolutely,
lady as well.
yeah.
Completely forgotten her name. Forgotten the
Me
names of
too.
the quilts.
I can't remember now either. It's 2 years ago.
How would you encourage people to become quilters?
I don't really know. So we have a friend who is very interested, but she's a lawyer and a young mom. And I think eventually she's going to be a quilter because she's experimenting with cloth and doing cute little things. Um, but she also has a baby daughter, so I think that her first sewing things for her daughter are going to be clothes. But I've said to her, when you're ready, I will show you what to do. And I think she'll make an amazing quilter when she gets there, and I think she will get there.
I do
Um,
too. Because I think when you get that passion for sewing, you always find a different outlet for it. If it's clothing or whatever, you always
yes.
find different outlets and you'll always try something and try something and try something and then something sticks.
So I also have a granddaughter, and when she was about 6, she was very interested in sewing. So I set up a little table and I gave her fabric to play with, and she put together blocks, which she sort of semi-appliques bits of lace and bits of fabric, but her color choices were amazing.
She
And
gets it from her
then
granny.
her, sorry,
She gets it from her granny.
I guess, yes. But then my grandsons were also interested, and what I can remember one day I had all three of them sewing here in the sewing room, and they were all doing different things. And in the end, they said, "Can't we make something for mommy with this?"
Oh my
So
goodness, that's so adorable.
somehow or other, I managed to put these blocks together, and they were beautifully naive. And then I put a border on it and backed it and bound it, and they gave it to mommy for Christmas. And I think it's still on the table every now and again, and it's probably 6 or 7 years ago now.
Not even being a parent, I would have kept it on the counter as well. Is when something is made with such pure, genuine love. How amazing.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that Hannah will come back to quilting, but she's lost interest again. She's 13 now, and she's bang in the middle of sport, and she's a very outdoorsy girl. So I haven't managed to get her back to quilting, but I'm not forcing it because I don't want her to think it wasn't fun, you know. So I've just left it, and we'll see where it evolves.
And you can't make it an obligation. It's got to be something that she naturally enjoys.
Exactly. But every now and again, I say to her, "You know, you're going to inherit my stash," in the hope that that'll make her come back to quilting.
Oh, that's really good. That's a very good point, though, is I do think that we need to make provisions for our stashes in our wills
Yes.
because it's very important. We have one lady in our sewing group who has said repeatedly that she's terrified the day she dies. Her husband's getting a skip, which is like a big, massive container,
Yes, I know what you mean.
and throwing everything from her sewing room into the skip just to get it out of the house so he never has to look at it again.
My husband's very sensitive about my sewing stuff, actually. He wouldn't do that. But I think he'd call in my daughter first. And I suspect at that point she might be interested in trying to do some quilting. I've taught her to sew, but I haven't taught her to quilt. But she did try. She cut some blocks even at some point, and then her job just got in the way. And she's a busy lady, and but I think she might get there eventually.
Well,
So
fingers crossed.
they are designated to get the stash, and I've said to my husband, and after that, um,
Again,
call in my quilting friends, let them come and help themselves.
don't say that too loudly. They may push you off the clog on before.
I hope not.
Well, they wouldn't. And the thing is, if one of your friends came and asked you for fabric, you'd give it to them anyway.
Of course,
Exactly.
yeah. I mean, there's so much of it.
And what
About,
is,
I don't know, about a year ago, I cleared out 8 shopping bags of fabric, and you couldn't even see a dent.
well, it's like my shop. Every time I have a sale or something and we pack orders and we're cutting for days and we get everything done and we finish, and at the end you look around the shop, you're like, it doesn't look as though anything has sold. Everything's still where it was. Oh,
Yes,
it's funny.
that's a quilter.
It is definitely. So what is next for you on your quilting journey?
So at the moment, I'm actually finishing my quilt for festival.
Can I tell you a secret?
Yes,
It's the 3rd of May.
I know.
The closing date for entries is tomorrow. I have not started any of the 3 quilts I'm doing.
Have you entered them though?
No, no, that has to happen tonight or tomorrow.
Yes.
I know, but I've not started them yet, and I've got to get them to South Africa by the 1st of June, which means I've got to
And do all
post
these
them.
interviews.
Mm. I'm not going mad at all. But yes, I think it's very important that we do exhibit our work, no matter how good or bad, because every single quilt will inspire somebody,
Yes, exactly.
and it really does. So
Mm.
how many are you entering?
So in the judging part, I'm just entering one. But now that they've opened it up for display, I'm going to enter another one in that category.
Good. So I did interrupt you there. So the next in the quilting journey is finishing off your quilts for festival.
Um, and then one of the things I love to do is to make quilts for great nephews, great nieces, you know, family. If they get married, I make a quilt. And there is a little great nephew who will be turning 3 in June, and he hasn't had a quilt yet. So I think that will be the next quilt. And I've just been in Durban, and my sister said, you know, there hasn't been a new quilt in this house for years.
Subtle,
No pressure. So I think after that, I'll probably be doing something for her,
whether you like it or not.
whether I like it or not. I will like it. I mean,
Or she will.
Yeah.
Oh,
In fact, already my brain is sort of looking at the color scheme of her room and deciding what to do. So there'll be another one there before the end of the year, I think.
very,
Um,
very exciting.
and then I think I told you earlier on that I was supposed to go to New Zealand and then my visa didn't come through. You may remember we had that brief chat. So I've postponed that trip now to September. Um, so that's going to be a break in my sewing, but I'll be heading off to New Zealand. I think these two quilts that I've just mentioned will probably take me through to about the end of August.
Wonderful.
Um, and the second quilt that I'm going to display at festival is actually to go to a little baby there. Um,
Wonderful.
so it wouldn't have been displayed if I'd gone now to New Zealand. Um, so I can display it before I take it to New Zealand.
That's
So
brilliant.
that's my schedule for the year, probably. I don't think I'll manage to do much when I come back. So
It's all right. But you can go and then curate a whole new collection of fabric in New Zealand.
shush.
And your husband now bans you from ever talking to me again. Kathy, is there anything else that you may want to say that I may not have asked you?
I don't think so. Um, no, I think we've covered most of it
Brilliant.
with lots of hilarity.
Whether you wanted it or not. Well, thank you, Kathy, so much for your time today. Thank you all so much for joining us on this installment, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. I'm Kathryn Newton, and everybody calls me Kathy. And my quilt name is an African voice, and I did it because I think that both the barbet bird and shweshwe are very distinctive South African voices. Um, so that was the motivation to make my little quilt.